Tonight, we uncover a hidden thread weaving through centuries of power, secrecy, and forbidden knowledge. A connection so silent, so deliberate, that the Vatican did not simply guard it. They orchestrated it. A network not built by kings or warriors, but forged in shadowed halls, candlelit lodges, and the quiet hands of those sworn to carry the light. Its influence shaped empires, guided discoveries, and preserved secrets that could rewrite everything we think we know about history. Those who tried to trace it faced closed archives, coded manuscripts, and a silence so profound it could swallow generations of scholars. And those who glimpsed the full pattern, they vanished behind locked doors, their work lost to the vigilant guardians of knowledge. Before the veil lifts, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Beneath the marble floors of St. Peter's Basilica, where pilgrims kneel and whisper prayers into eternity, there are corridors no map dares to mark. It is said that within those depths, deeper than the crypts of popes, deeper than the catacombs of saints, a second light burns. Not the divine glow of candles or the sun filtering through stained glass, but something older, quieter, almost human. For centuries, whispers have passed between archivists, cardinals, and scholars who walk the Vatican's silent halls at night. They speak of a lamp that never goes out, a lamp said to guard the knowledge forbidden to the world above. They call it the lamp in the vault. Most dismiss the tale as myth, a poetic rumour woven by curious monks, but every myth begins with a truth someone once tried to hide. The story begins not in mystery, but in the hunger for knowledge. When Rome fell in the 5th century, the world did not simply collapse, it folded. Empires shattered, languages drifted into silence, and libraries burned until their ashes filled the sky. Yet, even as flames devoured parchment and ink, a quiet order within the church began collecting what survived. Scrolls, star charts, fragments of pagan philosophy, and mechanical drawings disappeared from sight, but not from existence. They were taken somewhere no invader could reach, beneath the Vatican itself. There, a select few became their guardians, instructed not to read, only to protect. But knowledge is never content to sleep. The vault, according to ancient records, was built under the first basilica, constructed by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. At its centre burned a flame, said to have been lit with oil from the temple of Jupiter. Over the centuries, that lamp became a symbol for something the world was not yet ready to face. The meeting point between divine faith and forbidden wisdom. It represented an uneasy alliance between those who served God and those who sought truth through reason. The two could never coexist in daylight, but in the dark beneath Rome, they shared the same fire. Some historians have found strange notations in old Vatican ledgers, references to custodes lucis, the keepers of the light. Their duties were never publicly recorded, yet the same phrase appears in writings from the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and even in the sealed journals of a Jesuit astronomer from 1643. Each time, it surfaces quietly, then disappears again, as if someone ensured the world would never draw the full line between them. When you stand in street, Peter's Square today, and gaze at the towering obelisk, remember it once stood in Egypt, where priests of another faith used it to mark the rising of the Sunday. Its shadow still crosses the basilica floor each day, touching the same marble under which the vault is said to rest. Perhaps that is no coincidence. Perhaps the church that claims to bring light to the world has always kept another light hidden, one meant not for faith, but for understanding. And if that lamp truly burns, then it burns not for God, but for the ones who dared to know. In the quiet of a Benedictine monastery, deep in the Italian hills, a monk bends over a parchment illuminated by candlelight. It is the year 1272. His quill moves carefully across the page, copying a Latin sermon about divine order. But between the lines, he leaves a faint mark, barely visible to the untrained eye, a single word written sideways in the margin: Illuminati. For centuries, That word has carried dark rumors of secret power and unseen hands guiding the course of history. Yet in that small ink trace, its meaning is entirely different. It is not the name of a cult or a society, but a signal, a whisper among scholars who believed that light did not come only from heaven, but also from the mind. The Codex, discovered centuries later in the Vatican library, bears strange marks on several pages. Circles around words related to knowledge, truth, and vision. Tiny dots beneath the letters L and U, forming patterns that look almost mathematical. To the ordinary scribe, these would seem like errors, but to those who knew, they were the sign of a hidden fraternity. A circle of monks, scientists, and philosophers scattered across Europe who met not in person, but through text, leaving trails for one another in the margins of books. They called themselves the Illuminati, not in arrogance, but in reference to illumination, the act of bringing light to understanding. Their goal was not rebellion, but preservation. The age they lived in was a dangerous one. To question was to risk exile or death. Knowledge was filtered through doctrine, and even the shape of the earth could not be discussed freely. Yet these quiet men believed that truth, once written, could not truly be destroyed. It could be hidden, yes, but not erased. So they built a network of meaning disguised as devotion. They copied the scriptures like obedient servants, but hid fragments of Greek philosophy within the decorative borders. They annotated Bible margins with symbols that corresponded to lost scientific principles. In one book, the Latin word for light, lux, is written in gold ink that reveals under certain angles the geometry of a star. It was their way of leaving a message for those who would one day understand. When church authorities reviewed these texts, the marks were dismissed as embellishment, decoration, or wear from repeated copying. Yet, taken together, they form a map, connecting monasteries from Florence to Toledo, Paris to Cologne, a network that existed in silence, bound not by ritual, but by a single belief, that divine truth and natural truth were one and the same. Historians later tried to separate them, faith on one side, reason on the other, but the Illuminati of the margins never saw such a boundary. They believed that to know was to honour creation itself, and though their names were never recorded, their fingerprints remain on the pages we still read today. A faint shimmer in the corner of a manuscript, a word left unexplained, a name written where no one was supposed to look. The collapse of Rome did not happen in a single night. It was a slow unravelling, a dimming of one world while another quietly took its place. As kingdoms rose and fell, and the roads that once connected empires turned to dust, one group began to move in silence. They were not soldiers, nor merchants, but men in robes carrying chests filled not with gold, but with knowledge. From the 5th century onward, monasteries began to appear like islands of order in a sea of ruin. Their purpose, so history tells us, was to preserve what remained of civilization. But preservation is only one way to describe what happened. Another word might be gathering. Across the broken lands of Europe, monastic orders spread their influence, collecting every surviving manuscript they could find. Scrolls of Greek philosophy, Roman law, Egyptian astronomy, and early Christian theology vanished from public hands and reappeared behind monastery walls. Libraries that had once belonged to cities and scholars became property of the church. Each text was copied, catalogued, and sealed. To the outside world, it looked like salvation. Knowledge, after all, was safe within holy walls, but safety can also be a cage. The monks who copied these works did not copy them exactly as they were. They translated them into Latin, often simplifying, editing, or omitting anything that did not align with doctrine. A treatise on the movement of stars might lose its discussion of ancient deities. A text on medicine could be rewritten as a reflection on divine healing. And once the copies were complete, the originals were stored away or destroyed. The church became the single guardian of memory. No library outside its reach survived long. In Spain, when the Visigoths burned cities, monks arrived later to save what remained. In France, as wars swept through Gaul, abbeys rose to collect the remnants. Even in distant Britain, where civilization had all but vanished, monasteries like Lindisfarne became outposts of knowledge, sending their scribes to gather what little the pagan tribes had left behind. Over time, a vast network of scriptoria stretched across the continent. Each monastery acted as a node, feeding information toward one central point, the Vatican. What began as a mission of faith turned into a quiet consolidation of power. Those who sought wisdom had no choice but to seek it through the church. Independent scholars could no longer verify what was true. There was only one version of history, one version of science, one version of truth, and it belonged to the men who wrote it in God's name. Yet within this age of gathering, something remarkable also happened. Some monks, aware of what was being lost, began to leave subtle marks within the texts. Small symbols, hidden references, fragments of forbidden works woven between verses. They could not fight openly, but they could leave traces for the future, and in those faint traces, the light of knowledge survived, waiting for the day it would be free again. Silence is often mistaken for peace, but in the long corridors of power, silence is rarely born of calm. It is built, shaped, and maintained like architecture. After the fall of Rome, when chaos ruled the land and faith became the new authority, the Vatican learned that silence could be stronger than any army. A sword can kill a man, but silence can erase an idea. By the 7th century, this understanding had evolved into a method. There was no need to burn every forbidden book when one could simply hide it. No need to crush rebellion when confusion could make rebellion impossible. The architects of silence knew that control was not achieved through shouting, but through deciding who was allowed to speak at all. Censorship was the first layer of this design. It began with the Index of Forbidden Books, centuries later in formal name, but practiced long before. If a text threatened doctrine, it was condemned as heresy. If it raised questions that faith could not answer, it was labelled dangerous. But this was not the loud censorship of tyrants. It was a quiet removal. A missing line in a copied manuscript, a torn page, a book no longer copied at all, entire schools of thought vanished not in fire, but in omission. The second layer was custody. The Church positioned itself as the guardian of knowledge, claiming that only those trained in theology could safely interpret the wisdom of the ancients. Thus, the vaults and libraries became prisons of parchment. A scholar might know a book existed, but could never touch it. Custody, disguised as protection, made ignorance seem virtuous. The third layer was delay. When a discovery could not be denied, it could be postponed. Centuries passed between invention and acknowledgement, between discovery and permission. The design was brilliant. Truth was never fully destroyed, only slowed, kept just behind the present, so that humanity would always remain dependent on the institution that claimed to guard it. Silence, in this way, became policy. It was not written in law, but embedded in routine. Monks copied what was approved. Priests preached what was permitted. And generation after generation accepted that what they did not know must not be worth knowing. Over time, silence became invisible. People stopped noticing what was missing. They forgot there had ever been more to learn. In this stillness, the Vatican's influence deepened, not through violence, but through absence. The less the world remembered, the more it relied on those who claimed to remember for them. And yet, even within this engineered quiet, small tremors of dissent remained. A whisper here, a hidden diagram there, a monk who copied a forbidden word in the corner of a page. They were tiny cracks in the walls of silence, proof that no matter how carefully silence is built, it can never be perfect. And in those cracks, the light of truth waited patiently, knowing that one day someone would listen again. Long before satellites and digital maps, there were men who measured the world by hand, by stars, and by faith. They were called cartographers and cosmographers, though in truth they were something else entirely, guardians of forbidden knowledge. During the Middle Ages, when the Vatican's reach extended across every corner of Europe, these mapmakers lived in the shadows between religion and discovery. To the Church, a map was not merely a tool of navigation, it was a statement of belief. To draw the world was to define creation itself, and only one authority was permitted to define what God had made. Yet, from the 12th century onward, quiet figures began to appear across monasteries and coastal towns. They worked in silence, charting coastlines that official maps refused to acknowledge, tracing stars that had no place in the heavens, according to doctrine. Each map was a confession of curiosity, a risk, a rebellion drawn in ink. The most gifted among them were hired by bishops or abbots to produce ecclesiastical charts. Their work was expected to glorify divine order, to place Jerusalem at the center of the world, to erase lands and peoples that did not fit biblical geography. But when night fell and candles burned low, some of these same hands redrew the world as it truly was. Oceans stretched farther than anyone dared admit. Continents reached beyond imagination. They mapped not only what was known, but what was whispered to exist. These hidden maps did not belong to any kingdom. They belonged to truth itself. Some of them vanished soon after creation, sealed within vaults of the Vatican or quietly confiscated by inquisitors. Others resurfaced centuries later, their origins a mystery, bearing coastlines too accurate for their time. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, shows Antarctica without ice, a detail modern science only confirmed with sonar in the 20th century. How could such precision exist before telescopes or global exploration? The answer may lie within the silent oath the mapmakers shared. Among the scattered guilds of Europe, from Venice to Lisbon, there existed a tradition, a promise sworn not to kings but to knowledge. They vowed to preserve what they found, even if they could never claim it. The Church called them heretics, the world called them mad, but they called themselves witnesses. They believed that the earth was far older, far larger, and far more mysterious than any doctrine dared admit. Their charts became coded texts. A mountain drawn at a strange angle might represent a constellation. A winding river could mark a forgotten trade route to lands erased from official history. When questioned, they spoke of artistic choice. In truth, it was encryption. The oath bound them not to reveal what they knew until humanity was ready to see, and so their legacy drifted across time like messages in bottles, waiting for a world unafraid of its own horizon. Each line they drew was an act of defiance. Each compass stroke a prayer that one day truth would no longer need to hide beneath the ink. Time is the most powerful invention humanity has ever created because it governs not only how we live, but how we remember. In the centuries after Rome fell, time itself became the Church's most subtle weapon. Days, months, and years were no longer just a way to mark the passing of seasons. They became instruments of faith, tools to synchronize belief and obedience. The transformation began quietly in the 6th century, when a monk named Dionysius Exiguus proposed a new way to count the years. Instead of marking time from the founding of Rome, he began it from the supposed birth of Christ. The world, from that moment on, would live inside a Christian calendar. It may have seemed like a harmless adjustment, a technical correction, but it was far more than that. It rewrote the rhythm of civilization. Every date before became a time of darkness, every date after a march toward divine order. By the time the Gregorian reform was introduced in 1582, the Church's mastery of time was absolute. Pope Gregory XIII declared the Julian calendar inaccurate, claiming that the seasons had drifted. But behind the correction lay a deeper motive. To realign the world's days was to realign its memory. Centuries vanished overnight. 10 days were erased in an instant, as if history could be edited with the stroke of a pen. People went to sleep on October 4th and awoke on October 15th. Nothing changed in the sky, yet everything changed on paper. From then on, time itself was under papal authority. Every holy day, every feast, every fast was set according to church decree. Even the rhythms of labour and rest bent to sacred scheduling. By mastering the calendar, the Vatican mastered the flow of life. Farmers sowed when priests said to sow. Scholars dated their discoveries by the church's clock. Kings signed treaties and declared wars under its count. The measurement of time was now the measurement of obedience, but the church's control went even deeper. By controlling the calendar, it also controlled prophecy. Ancient seers, astronomers, and philosophers had tied their predictions to celestial cycles. If those cycles were shifted even slightly, so too were their meanings. A prophecy set to unfold in 1 century could be made to appear hundreds of years earlier or later. Those who mastered dates mastered narratives. It was no longer the stars that told humanity when to awaken, but the priests. Across Europe, this quiet manipulation shaped how people understood their place in history. Time became a story told by the church, and every second reinforced the illusion that divine authority was constant, unbroken, eternal. Yet, hidden in old astronomical records and ancient calendars from the East, the cracks remain. The numbers do not align. The sky tells a different story, one that cannot be edited or delayed. And in that truth, perhaps, lies the greatest key of all, that time itself may have been rewritten not to guide us forward, but to keep us from remembering where we truly began. In the cloistered halls of medieval monasteries, education was both a privilege and a danger. To learn was to walk a narrow path between revelation and heresy. Yet behind the solemn prayers and stone walls, another kind of learning quietly flourished. It was never announced, never named, and yet it shaped the future of Europe. They called it, in secret, the school without a door. It had no classrooms, no teachers who spoke aloud, and no books that could be openly read. Its lessons were whispered from one monk to another, passed like a flame hidden under a cloak. Geometry, optics, and the ancient art of memory were its sacred subjects. It began sometime around the 9th century, when fragments of Greek and Arabic texts started to find their way into the monasteries. Translated in secret, these writings spoke of mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, topics that the church viewed with suspicion. Still, certain scholars saw their value. They realized that the key to understanding the universe lay not in dogma, but in pattern. And so, they began to teach one another in silence. A monk would trace a circle in dust during a conversation about scripture, and another would recognize it as a symbol for geometry. A discussion on light and divinity might quietly shift toward the behavior of glass and reflection. The line between science and faith blurred, not by rebellion, but by quiet curiosity. Within these hidden lessons, knowledge moved like underground water, invisible but unstoppable. The school without a door had its own language. A carved spiral on a chapel column could represent the motion of the stars. A pattern in stained glass might conceal an equation. The structure of a cathedral could itself be a textbook, every arch and beam reflecting ratios known only to those who had studied within this secret circle. The monks called it divine architecture, but in truth it was geometry given life. Memory was their shield. They could not write their discoveries, so they trained their minds to hold entire books within thought. The ancient memory arts, techniques passed down from Greek orators, were reborn within the monasteries. Students would imagine vast halls within their minds, each filled with symbols and figures representing the principles they had learned. Knowledge was stored not on paper, but in imagination. It was safer that way, for ink could be erased, but memory could not be confiscated. Over the centuries, the school without a door spread from one monastery to another, from Italy to France, from France to England. Those who passed through it went on to build cathedrals, design astronomical clocks, and preserve the very spark of rational thought that would one day ignite the Renaissance. To the Church, they remained obedient monks. To history, they became the silent architects of knowledge. They proved that even when walls are built to contain truth, the mind will always find a way to walk through. Faith is a mirror. It reflects what people believe to be true, showing them an image of order, purpose, and divine certainty. Inquiry is a flame. It burns through that reflection, searching for what lies behind it. In the long centuries, when the Church ruled the mind of Europe, both the mirror and the flame existed side by side, yet never as equals. The Vatican learned early that the flame of curiosity could not be fully put out. It could only be contained, fed sparingly to those who could handle it, and hidden from those who might let it spread. The great paradox of the Middle Ages was that the Church, while claiming to guard truth, also guarded knowledge, and in doing so, it became both protector and warden of the human mind. Within monastery walls, monks copied not only sacred scripture, but fragments of forbidden science, philosophy, and mathematics. They were told that these works served to glorify God, yet deep down, many knew they served something else too, the endless hunger to understand. Faith provided the mirror in which the world saw its reflection, but in the hearts of certain scholars, the flame flickered quietly. To the priests, faith was safety. To the thinkers, faith was glass, clear enough to look through if one dared. The flame they nurtured was never public. It burned in private libraries, in whispered debates, in the glow of candlelight cast on parchment. The Vatican's control was not total. It needed those who could think, just not too much. The flame was useful when it could illuminate doctrine, dangerous when it questioned it. So, a silent agreement was born, one that lasted for centuries. Knowledge would be allowed to grow, but only within the mirror's frame. Anything that threatened to melt that boundary was forbidden. The scholars who walked this fine line were not heretics. They were the intermediaries, the chosen minds who received the flame and were sworn never to reveal its source. They used metaphors to mask meaning, writing about angels when they meant stars, about divine order when they meant geometry. Their works read like sermons, but their equations hid inside the rhythm of prayer. To the faithful, they were saints of learning. To one another, they were keepers of the spark. The Church called this balance divine harmony, but it was really control by illusion. Reflection without truth is only repetition. Fire without air is suffocation. And yet the flame endured, generation after generation, passed like a secret torch from monk to philosopher, from philosopher to scientist. When the Renaissance dawned, many believed the flame had just been lit. But in truth, it had been burning all along, hidden behind the mirror of faith, waiting for the moment when it would finally be free to blaze without fear. There was a time when the most dangerous words in Europe did not appear in books or sermons, but in letters. Not ordinary letters, but messages that travelled from monastery to monastery, with no sender and no name to greet. They were written in delicate Latin, sealed with wax, and delivered by monks who were told never to ask who they came from or where they were going. These were the letters to nowhere. Their contents were strange, sometimes poetic, sometimes mathematical, always incomplete. Each letter contained a question rather than an answer. What is light without shadow? How many circles can fit within the soul? What happens when time bends before the Sunday? To the casual reader, these lines made no sense. But to those who understood, they were challenges, riddles that opened the mind rather than closed it. The letters formed part of a hidden dialogue among thinkers who could never meet face to face. The age was too dangerous for open debate. To question doctrine was to invite ruin. So the thinkers of faith and reason found another way. They built their own secret classroom through the mail. A monk in France might receive a letter from Toledo with a strange geometric drawing and an unsigned note. A few months later, A reply would arrive from Florence, expanding the idea, correcting the figure, adding a new layer of meaning. The chain could stretch across years and across borders. No one ever claimed ownership of the ideas, because ideas were safer when they belonged to no one. The style of the letters was deliberately cryptic. Some used biblical allegory, hiding scientific questions inside the language of scripture. Others used codes drawn from music or astronomy, replacing words with symbols of planets and stars. Many letters began with the same phrase, lux quaeritur, the light is sought. It became their greeting, their password, their vow. The Vatican knew of these letters, but rarely intercepted them. They appeared harmless, the musings of devout monks and scholars. Yet the knowledge they carried was revolutionary. Through this hidden correspondence, concepts of motion, proportion, and even early theories of magnetism were exchanged long before universities would teach them. These were not rebels plotting to overthrow the church. They were believers who thought truth itself was another form of prayer. They solved problems not to defy God, but to understand his design more deeply. And so they wrote in humility, in secret, sending their thoughts into the unknown, trusting that somewhere another seeker would find them. Many of these letters were lost, destroyed by time, or buried in archives where no one reads anymore. But a few survived, hidden in the margins of manuscripts, or misfiled in dusty chests. They remind us that knowledge does not always march in public halls. Sometimes it travels quietly, wrapped in parchment, nameless and unseen. And though centuries have passed, their message remains the same. The light is sought, always. When people walk into a cathedral, they see a place of prayer. But to those who understand its hidden language, it is a book written in stone. Every arch, column, and window is a sentence. Every ratio a word in a secret grammar known only to the builders. During the 12th and 13th centuries, when Europe was said to be lost in darkness, cathedrals began to rise across the continent like mountains of light. Chartres, Notre Dame, Canterbury, Cologne. Their designs seemed to appear from nowhere, yet they shared patterns too precise to be coincidence. Geometry guided their every line. Circles within triangles, triangles within squares, all connected by the golden ratio, the same proportion found in seashells and stars. The builders called it divine measure, but it was more than faith. It was mathematics turned into music, the vibration of truth made visible. The master masons who oversaw these projects were no ordinary labourers. They were inheritors of knowledge passed down from ancient architects, knowledge that had survived the fall of Rome, hidden within the church's own walls. They worked in silence, speaking in symbols carved into stone, compasses etched discreetly into scaffolds. Their guilds guarded the art of building as if it were sacred scripture, and in a way, it was. They believed that creation itself could be understood through structure, that by mastering form and light, one could approach the mind of God. The clergy believed the cathedrals glorified heaven, but the builders knew they also taught lessons that could not be preached aloud. Light was their most faithful messenger. Stained glass windows were more than decoration. They were instruments designed to capture and bend sunlight in ways that mirrored the movements of the heavens. At certain hours, light would fall exactly across the altar or a particular mosaic, marking solstices and equinoxes, aligning faith with the cosmos. To the initiated, these effects were not miracles but calculations, proof that divine order was also natural order. Every cathedral was a map of the universe. Its pillars represented the elements, its spires reached towards celestial spheres, its crypts mirrored the underworld of myth and memory. Even the floor plans carried meaning. The cross-shaped layout symbolized resurrection, but hidden within that shape were geometric patterns older than Christianity itself. Circles of 12 echoed the zodiac, the 12 signs, the 12 apostles, the 12 stages of alchemical transformation. The churchgoers who gathered beneath these vaults never knew that the very stones around them whispered lessons in physics and philosophy. They prayed to God while standing inside a textbook of the universe. The builder's grammar required no words, only symmetry and silence. When questioned about their methods, the masons would smile and speak of faith, but their eyes told another story, one of equations and star charts. Their legacy survives not in books, but in the cathedrals themselves, where every shadow and beam of light still speaks a language few remember how to read. In those silent walls, truth remains carved forever, waiting for someone to listen again. There was once a list that frightened kings and silenced scholars more than any army ever could. It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. Created by the Vatican in the year 1559, it named every book that no good Christian was allowed to read. To possess one was to risk excommunication or worse. To write one was to risk fire. Yet, like every wall built to contain knowledge, the index became something more than a barrier. For those who could read between the lines, it was an invitation. The list was long and changed often. Works by philosophers, scientists, poets, and even priests appeared on it. Galileo, Copernicus, Descartes, and thousands of others joined its ranks. But the curious thing is this: many of the books banned by the Church were the same ones that dared to ask questions about the nature of truth, time, and the universe. To the fearful, the index was a warning. To the brave, it was a map showing exactly where the doors of forbidden thought could be found. In monasteries and universities, whispers spread among young scholars. If you wanted to know what the Church feared most, you only needed to read the list. The names of the books glowed like hidden stars, each one a guide to a new frontier of understanding. Copies of these forbidden works did not vanish. They simply went underground. Secret libraries appeared in basements, attics, and hidden compartments behind chapel walls. Some priests themselves became protectors of the banned, believing that knowledge, like light, could be delayed but not destroyed. Every time the Church struck a name from the record, another hand wrote it again in secret ink. It was a quiet rebellion, fought not with swords, but with words. The index gave power to the very things it condemned. When a book is declared dangerous, it becomes irresistible. Readers felt drawn to the danger itself, sensing that anything forbidden so fiercely must hold something true. Over the centuries, the index grew heavier, thicker, and more desperate. By the 19th century, it contained thousands of titles from every corner of the world. But it could not stop the tide of curiosity. The printing press had made secrecy impossible. Knowledge multiplied faster than the censors could burn it. By the time the Church officially abolished the index in 1966, its purpose had already been reversed. What began as a list of suppression had become a memorial to curiosity. Each banned book was a monument to a question once silenced. Today, historians see the index not only as a symbol of fear, but as a perfect reflection of human desire. It shows, page by page, that knowledge will always find a way through the cracks of control. The forbidden becomes the guide. The warning becomes the call. And in the end, the list that tried to erase truth became the very thing that kept it alive. The year was 1472. The air in Rome thick with candle smoke and quiet tension. Behind the marble walls of an unmarked chapel, a small group of men gathered after midnight. They came from two worlds that were never meant to meet. On one side sat bishops draped in scarlet robes, their rings heavy with gold and authority. On the other, scholars, mathematicians, and physicians, men whose curiosity had carried them dangerously close to heresy. The meeting was never recorded, yet whispers of it have echoed through centuries. Some called it the Council in Shadow. It began with an argument, spoken softly, but with the weight of fear. The Church, one bishop said, could not stop the spread of knowledge forever. The old world was stirring again. Books once hidden were being copied. Ideas once buried were finding voice. Yet to allow that light to shine freely would risk the church's authority. Civilization, they said, was like a flame. It could warm, but it could also burn. The scholars listened in silence. They knew the truth of it. Across Europe, new discoveries in optics, mechanics, and medicine were awakening minds. But each revelation came with danger. For every discovery, there was an inquisition. For every question, a prison cell. The church could not suppress knowledge without destroying the very order it wished to preserve. The scholars could not spread knowledge without inviting their own deaths. Something had to give. And so, in that hidden room, a bargain was struck. The church would not extinguish the lamp of learning, only conceal it beneath a veil. The savants would be allowed to continue their work under the protection of patronage, as long as their findings remained cloaked in religious language. A book on astronomy could speak of divine harmony. A study of the human body could be presented as praise for creation. Truth would survive, but in disguise. One bishop placed a single candle at the center of the table. "This," he said, "is knowledge. We will keep it lit, but never let it be seen without the cloth." The scholars agreed, some out of fear, some out of wisdom. They knew that if the flame died completely, the Dark Ages would never end. As the candle burned low, a silence filled the room, and one by one, the men placed their hands over their hearts, swearing to protect the light until the world was ready. When dawn came, the chapel doors opened, and the council vanished into history. No documents were signed, no decrees announced, but the effects of that night rippled for centuries. The Renaissance would rise not as a rebellion, but as a controlled dawn, the lamp burning quietly beneath the veil. And though no record bears the council's name, the world that followed bears its mark. A light that glows but never blazes, a truth that lives but never speaks, a flame that waits for the moment when the veil will finally be lifted. History teaches us that the Renaissance was a sudden rebirth, a miracle of genius erupting after 1,000 years of darkness. But what if it was never a spontaneous awakening at all? What if the light of the Renaissance had been burning quietly all along, hidden behind monastery walls, waiting for permission to be seen? The so-called rediscovery of ancient wisdom in the 14th and 15th centuries may not have been a discovery at all, but a controlled release. A carefully measured opening of a vault that had been locked by design. For centuries, Europe had been taught that knowledge was dangerous. Then suddenly, it was celebrated. Artists, architects, and thinkers began producing works of breathtaking brilliance, and the world was told that humanity had finally emerged from its slumber. But no civilization rises that fast without preparation. The ideas that blossomed during the Renaissance did not appear from nowhere. They came from the hidden schools of thought, the quiet scriptoria, the guarded archives where forbidden manuscripts had been copied and preserved in secret. Those monks who once whispered about geometry and light had planted seeds that would only bloom when the church decided the time was right. The release was not chaotic, it was managed. The church allowed certain works of the ancients to resurface, but always through chosen intermediaries, men of faith who could frame old ideas in a safe theological light. Plato returned, but as a Christian philosopher. Pythagoras was praised, but only as a servant of divine order. Even Copernicus, centuries later, would dedicate his heliocentric theory to the Pope himself, as if asking permission to tell the truth. The pattern was clear. Knowledge flowed again, but through narrow channels the church could control. The artists, too, were part of this release. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, and others were not just geniuses, they were insiders of a deeper current. Their art reflected not only beauty, but encoded geometry, astronomy, and symbolism too precise to be mere decoration. The Vatican funded them, displayed their work, and in doing so, directed how enlightenment would appear to the public. The Renaissance, then, was both revelation and restraint. The world was shown just enough light to believe it was free, while the deepest truths remained buried beneath marble and paint. It was a release valve, easing the pressure of centuries of secrecy without ever surrendering control. The Church adapted because it had to. The world was changing. Printing presses were spreading ideas faster than censors could burn them, and people were beginning to look up at the stars again. So the Vatican changed its mask. It became the patron of light, even though it had long been its keeper in shadow. And by doing so, it ensured that even the rebirth of reason would carry its blessing. The Renaissance was not a new dawn. It was a window opened just wide enough to let the world believe it had awakened. But beyond the window, the vault remained sealed. The word appeared first in the margins of a manuscript, faint and almost uncertain: Illuminati. It meant the enlightened ones, but not in the way we understand it now. In the beginning, it was not the name of a secret order or a brotherhood. It was a whisper used by scholars, monks, and travellers who carried knowledge across forbidden lines. They were not rebels. They were couriers of light, men and women who moved between the sacred and the secular, ferrying ideas too dangerous to stay in one place. As the Renaissance unfolded and the flow of knowledge widened, the pattern became clearer. Everywhere that wisdom was hidden, a few brave souls emerged to carry it forward. In Florence, artists who painted angels with the geometry of the stars. In Prague, alchemists who disguised experiments as prayers. In Spain, philosophers who wrote in code to protect their lives. They shared no charter, no headquarters, no secret handshake, yet they all obeyed the same invisible law, that light must not be allowed to die. Over time, outsiders began to notice the pattern. The same symbols appeared in cathedrals and libraries, separated by hundreds of miles. The same phrases surfaced in letters written decades apart. The same geometry reappeared in works of art under different names. The Church called it coincidence. The scholars called it preservation. But among the few who understood, a name began to take shape: the Illuminati, not as a formal order, but as a mirror reflecting anyone who dared to seek and protect truth under the veil of faith. By the 16th century, the word had gained a quiet power. To some, it was an accusation. To others, a badge of honor. The Vatican tolerated the rumor as long as it remained harmless. It could even be useful. If the people believed in a mysterious class of thinkers working beneath the Church, it strengthened the illusion that enlightenment still flowed through sacred channels. But behind that illusion, real men and women risked their lives to keep ideas alive. They met in candlelit rooms, traded coded diagrams, and copied ancient texts onto scraps of parchment. They knew that if caught, the punishment would be swift and final. Yet still they worked, believing that light could outlast darkness if enough hands carried it forward. The name Illuminati became their shield and their curse. It gave form to a movement that could never afford to be visible. Over time, myths grew around it, twisting truth into legend. The world forgot that, before the conspiracies, before the fear, the word had meant something simple: those who seek to understand. Those who refuse to let the flame die. And perhaps that is the truest form of illumination. Not secret power, not control, but the quiet courage to carry knowledge when the world insists on living in the dark. In the middle of the 16th century, a new order rose within the Church, one that would shape the next 400 years of history more than any army or king. They were called the Society of Jesus, but the world came to know them by a simpler name, the Jesuits. At first, they appeared to be humble missionaries, scholars, and teachers. But beneath the surface, they were something far more complex. They were the Church's most brilliant minds and its most disciplined soldiers, bound by vows of obedience so absolute that they could act with the precision of a single thought. Their founder, Ignatius of Loyola, understood that power no longer came only from thrones or swords, it came from minds. So he built an army of intellect. The Jesuits studied astronomy, mathematics, languages, philosophy, and the new sciences emerging from a changing world. They founded universities across Europe and beyond, from Rome to Beijing, from Paris to Lima. Their schools became the beating heart of education, producing generations of thinkers, priests, and rulers. To the world, they were guardians of learning. To the Vatican, they were both weapon and shield. Wherever knowledge grew, the Jesuits were there, mapping it, translating it, and deciding which truths should see the light. Their libraries overflowed with manuscripts no one else was allowed to read. Their observatories tracked the movements of the stars, with instruments finer than any others in Europe. Their letters travelled across oceans, carrying reports of cultures, inventions, and discoveries that few outside their circle ever saw. It was brilliance wrapped in secrecy, and that secrecy sparked fear. Some saw them as protectors of wisdom, guiding humanity toward order. Others saw them as manipulators, shaping knowledge to serve power. The truth, as always, lies between. The Jesuits were both. They preserved what others would have destroyed, yet they also controlled what others should have known. Their network was vast, so vast that kings began to fear it. They advised monarchs, tutored princes, and whispered in the ears of popes. When they spoke, nations listened. When they fell silent, people wondered why. To some, their discipline looked like devotion. To others, it looked like control. The Jesuits built observatories to study the heavens, yet they reported only what fit the Church's timeline. They opened schools to spread knowledge, yet every lesson led back to the same conclusion, that truth flowed through Rome. In time, even the Vatican grew uneasy with their reach. They had become too powerful, too independent, too knowing. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV dissolved the order, calling it a necessary act of purification. But a few decades later, they returned, stronger and quieter than before. The Jesuit problem was never about faith or rebellion. It was about balance, the eternal question of whether knowledge should serve authority or guide it. And as long as that question remains unanswered, the shadow of the Jesuit will never fade. Beneath the marble courtyards of Vatican City, deeper than the catacombs and quieter than the tombs, there is said to be a vault that no one is allowed to fully see. The official name is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, but those who know its legend call it something else, the Vault of Contradictions. It is a place where opposites live side by side, a library where the sacred and the forbidden sit on the same shelf, theology beside astronomy, mysticism beside mechanics, the divine next to the mathematical. To the outside world, it sounds impossible, yet that is precisely the paradox that defines it. For centuries, the Church has claimed to guard truth. But truth, like fire, cannot be handled without being burned. So instead of destroying what it feared, the Church learned to keep everything. Every idea, every heresy, every discovery that might threaten its image was locked away rather than lost. The paradox became policy: keep both, reveal neither. Within those silent corridors are said to rest the works of the world's greatest minds, some known, others forgotten. Galileo's forbidden notes on the movement of the planets, Da Vinci's missing sketches of machines too advanced for his time, alchemical texts written in languages that no one can decipher, ancient maps showing coastlines long before they were officially discovered. The Vatican does not deny the existence of these archives, only the access to them. Scholars must request each document by name, as if they already know what they are looking for. But how can one request what one has never been told exists? That is the genius of the vault. It hides not only information, but the awareness that information is missing. Inside, history is not linear, but layered. For every text that declares the earth the center of creation, another describes it orbiting the sunday. For every argument about divine will, there is a scientific observation of natural law. The contradictions are not errors. They are deliberate, preserved side by side, so that truth can never be entirely erased, nor entirely confirmed. This way, the Church remains both right and righteous, no matter which century it stands in. Even the archivists are said to be divided, some serving faith, others serving fact. The result is a kind of equilibrium, a frozen moment in history where knowledge does not progress or vanish but waits. The Vatican presents the vault as a sign of its responsibility, a guardian of the past. Yet, in reality, it is a mirror of human nature itself, the eternal struggle between what we believe and what we know. If the vault were ever opened completely, the world might finally see that faith and science were never enemies, only reflections of the same search. But perhaps that is exactly why it will never be opened. In silence, the contradictions keep their balance, and the vault continues to guard not just the secrets of the Church, but the uneasy truth about humanity's need to believe and its fear to know. There was a time when knowledge was not just debated, it was judged, and the courtroom was not a place of justice, but a stage. In the late Middle Ages and the centuries that followed, the Church turned the pursuit of truth into theatre. The trials of heresy were not meant to discover guilt or innocence. They were lessons, carefully performed to remind the world where the fence lines stood between faith and forbidden thought. The audience was not just the gathered crowd, but all of Europe, watching through rumour, sermon, and fear. When the Inquisition summoned a scholar, philosopher, or monk, it was not merely to punish him, it was to craft a story in which questioning became sin and obedience became survival. The heretic became the warning, his silence the applause. The trial of Galileo in 1633 is the best remembered, but it was only one act in a much longer play. Standing before the tribunal, he was not asked to prove the earth moved around the Sunday. He was asked to renounce that truth for the sake of order. When he whispered that the earth still moves, it was not defiance, it was despair. The Church had no need to kill him. It was enough to make him bow. That image of a kneeling genius carried more power than any execution ever could. It told every thinker watching that discovery was allowed, but only within the boundaries set by faith. The same scene had played out many times before and would again for centuries. Monks who translated ancient Greek texts without permission, physicians who studied the human body too closely, astronomers who drew maps of the stars that did not match the Book of Genesis. Each was placed before a tribunal, condemned for pride, and paraded as an example. But what most people never realized is that the Church did not destroy every heretic's work. Often, it kept copies, quietly archived for future study. The performance was never about truth itself. It was about control of the stage. The heretic's ideas were locked away while his fate was made public. The burning of books and the burning of bodies were not acts of ignorance. They were signals, boundaries drawn in smoke, and beyond those boundaries, silence. Even in the Renaissance, when art and science seemed to flourish, the theatre continued. Scholars learned to speak in allegory, to hide equations in hymns, to write about the movement of angels when they meant the planets. They performed obedience to protect understanding. The Church allowed them their stage, as long as they knew their roles. It was a delicate balance, a play that never truly ended, because even today, the memory of those trials still echoes. Every age has its fence line, and every thinker must decide how close to stand. The theatre of heresy was never about faith versus reason. It was about the fear that if truth ever spoke too loudly, the audience might stop believing in the script. In the bustling streets of Florence during the year 1492, artists laboured over canvases, printers set type in dim workshops, and instrument makers shaped delicate devices from brass and wood. Yet few knew who provided the coins, the materials, or the permission to work without fear. Behind every brushstroke, every printed page, every compass calibrated to the stars, there was a hand that remained invisible. The benefactor left no signature. History forgot to ask who paid the candlemaker, yet the flame burned brighter because of that quiet support. Across Europe, This pattern repeated. In Venice, a printer produced books containing translations of ancient texts, in secret, funded by a patron whose identity was never recorded. In Paris, a clockmaker constructed astronomical instruments with precision beyond his understanding, his fees delivered in unmarked sacks. These were the ghosts of patronage, guiding the flow of knowledge without recognition. The system was subtle. Too much fame could endanger the recipient. Too much secrecy could slow progress. So the phantom patrons learned to balance generosity with discretion. The Church, aware of this practice, sometimes tolerated it because it ensured that discoveries could be guided rather than suppressed. If a printer learned too much too quickly, the Vatican could intervene before the ideas spread dangerously. If an artist worked in alignment with sacred principles, the benefits were silently approved. Florence, Rome, Prague, and Cologne became centers of a hidden network of support, an underground economy of intellect. Patrons supplied books, tools, and advice, but never sought credit. The recipients, aware of the invisible hand, left clues of their work in the margins of manuscripts or in the geometry of their architecture, yet rarely acknowledged the funding. It was a system built to move knowledge safely through dangerous times. Some historians dismiss this as coincidence or generosity, but patterns emerge when studied closely. The same families appear repeatedly as sources of support for thinkers and inventors whose names became famous, yet the link to their benefactors vanished from records. The phantom patron ensured that the lamp of learning remained lit, that discoveries were nurtured, and that ideas could survive long enough to be shared at the right time. Artists painted, printers published, instrument makers measured, and the benefactor remained a shadow. No signature, no monument, no recognition. Yet without this quiet hand, much of the knowledge we celebrate as the Renaissance might have been delayed, destroyed, or never created. It was a partnership of silence and vision, a pact between those who could imagine and those who could provide. The world may never know the names, but the works themselves are proof that someone believed in the power of light, even when the streets were dark and history forgot to ask who carried the candle. The year was 1610, and Europe was on the edge of a quiet revolution. It was not armies that marched, or kings who decreed change, but instruments so small they could fit in a scholar's hand. Telescopes and microscopes began to appear, widening the world in ways that no painting or book ever could. The telescope pointed to the heavens and revealed planets, moons, and stars moving in patterns that contradicted centuries of accepted doctrine. The microscope revealed a universe so small and intricate that it defied imagination, teeming with forms unseen by any eye before. These inventions did not make noise on the battlefield, yet they carried more power than cannons or swords. They changed what humans could see, and what humans can see shapes what humans believe. The Church, which had long held the authority to define truth, realized the danger immediately. If the heavens could be measured, if the stars did not align with Scripture, then the story of creation itself might be questioned. Galileo, who peered through his telescope in 1610 and discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, understood this risk. His observations did not merely expand knowledge, they undermined centuries of unquestioned authority, revealing a cosmos in motion rather than a fixed, God-centered universe. The microscope, though less dramatic, was no less revolutionary. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, centuries later, discovered a hidden world of tiny living creatures. Life existed in ways no one had imagined, and suddenly humans could see that the universe was far more complex than texts had ever claimed. These inventions were dangerous, not because they killed, but because they enlightened. They offered a way to bypass the filter of sanctioned knowledge, to witness reality without interpretation. Every lens was a challenge to control, a new frontier that authority could no longer fully dictate. Yet control was attempted. Galileo was forced to recant, imprisoned under house arrest. Early microscopists worked quietly, careful not to draw attention to discoveries that might be deemed heretical. Even the instruments themselves were regulated. Those who built telescopes and microscopes often did so in secret, passing designs quietly among trusted hands. The flame of inquiry had to be contained even as it burned brighter. The revolutions of the lens were subtle at first, but their consequences could not be hidden. By widening the visible world, they expanded thought itself. Minds began to question. If the smallest things could reveal such astonishing truths, what else had been hidden by authority for centuries? The telescope and the microscope proved that observation could not be censored entirely. Knowledge could be delayed, secrets could be stored, but once sight had been given, the world would never look at the universe in the same way again. In the quiet turning of glass and the bending of light, power shifted. The smallest inventions became the most dangerous, because they made it impossible to remain blind. And once humans could see, they could never unsee. By the 17th century, Europe was a continent of books. Public libraries began to rise in cities from Paris to Florence, Venice to London. Scholars, students, and curious citizens could now read and learn in ways that were impossible just a few generations earlier. Knowledge seemed to flow freely, a river expanding across the continent. Yet beneath this apparent openness, another system operated quietly, almost invisibly. It was the double archive. For every book that entered the public library, there was a counterpart that was withheld, catalogued in a secret ledger for the eyes of only a few. The general population could study scripture, philosophy, and sanctioned sciences, but the forbidden knowledge was stored elsewhere. It was not destroyed, only hidden. The double archive created a careful balance. Public libraries served to educate, to satisfy curiosity within safe boundaries. The private ledger ensured that anything too dangerous, too disruptive, or too enlightening for the masses remained under control. Manuscripts on alchemy, astronomy, alternative philosophies, even ancient texts that contradicted doctrine were quietly filed and watched. The custodians of the secret ledger were highly trained, often members of monastic orders, the Jesuits, or scholars sworn to secrecy. They knew that a single misstep could unravel centuries of careful control. Each ledger entry was a record of what existed, who had access, and what could be allowed to resurface in the future. In this way, the Church and its allied scholars maintained not just knowledge, but power over memory itself. The public saw a world of learning expanding every year, and assumed history and science were progressing naturally. But the double archive ensured that the deepest, most transformative ideas were delayed, sometimes for generations. It was a quiet governance, invisible to most, yet profoundly effective. Ideas did not vanish, they were preserved, measured, and released only when timing aligned with authority. The system was not evil, only precise. It reflected a belief that knowledge could be dangerous if released too quickly, that minds needed to be guided before being allowed to wander too far. Over time, the public catalogue and the secret ledger grew alongside each other, two maps of human thought, one visible, one hidden. Scholars who gained access to the double archive understood that power and wisdom were inseparable. To know what the public could not was to understand history, science, and culture in ways most could never imagine. And so the double archive became the invisible engine of civilization, quietly shaping what generations would learn, what questions they would ask, and what truths they might never see. Libraries could bloom, but the ledger ensured that some doors remained closed, that some flames burned only for those who had been chosen to carry them. In this balance, knowledge was both shared and protected, freedom and control intertwined in silence. By the late 17th century, a new layer of European society had begun to emerge, hidden in plain sight. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, private academies, and salons all flourished in cities, from Paris to Vienna. They were spaces where knowledge, ritual, and influence intertwined, a network operating beyond the eyes of kings and clergy. By day, members might attend church, bowing to the altar and following the rules of faith. By night, they gathered in lodges, laboratories, and drawing rooms to share ideas that could not be spoken aloud during daylight hours. The lodges were not always conspiracies. They were schools in secrecy, incubators of mathematics, natural philosophy, and philosophy of mind. Each member carried training from earlier clandestine networks, the scholars who had survived centuries of censorship, the silent teachers of the school without a door. Symbols and rituals were the language. The compass, the square, the sun, the eye, all encoded centuries of knowledge, geometry, and philosophy. To the uninitiated, the ceremonies seemed strange or meaningless. To those who understood, every handshake, every emblem, every architectural choice carried lessons too dangerous to publish in print. Within these networks, competition and cooperation existed in equal measure. Academies and salons vied to attract the brightest minds, the ones capable of innovation, yet they also shared discoveries carefully after dusk. Knowledge was both a tool of status and a shared responsibility. The Rosicrucians traced their lineage to mysticism older than the Church, claiming secrets from Egypt and Babylon. They passed down handwritten manuscripts filled with coded metaphysics and alchemical formulas. The Freemasons, originally master builders, maintained architectural wisdom that preserved geometry, astronomy, and the art of proportion. Each society guarded its methods, yet whenever a member crossed boundaries, some knowledge flowed, connecting the hidden dots of Europe's intellectual map. In this way, the lodges became a parallel network to the church-controlled archives, sometimes cooperating, sometimes contesting authority. Members learned when to follow the rules and when to act beyond them. In the salons of Paris, philosophers debated new ideas that might have been heretical in public. In London, artisans shared designs that reflected centuries of hidden study. In Vienna, mathematicians exchanged calculations that would later guide navigation and astronomy. Yet in all of it, the masks remained. One could not reveal too much, and one could not reveal too little. Success depended on discretion. The Church watched from the shadows, aware of these networks, but often unable to intervene without revealing its own gaps in control. Knowledge moved in parallel streams, sometimes touching, sometimes avoiding each other, but always flowing. By the 18th century, these lodges and masks had become essential to Europe's intellectual survival. They preserved lessons, shared light, and trained minds that would eventually question every assumption about history, science, and authority. And though public records rarely acknowledged them, the lodges ensured that truth, like a hidden flame, never fully died. They were the invisible bridges between chapel and laboratory, faith and reason, obedience and curiosity, shaping a world that would awaken fully only when the time was right. By the 18th century, Europe had entered what some historians call the Age of Exposure. The printing press, now well established, had begun to churn out newspapers, pamphlets, and encyclopedias at a speed unimaginable in earlier centuries. Knowledge, once contained within stone walls and secret libraries, was spilling into public view. For the first time in hundreds of years, ordinary people could read about science, philosophy, and history without relying on intermediaries. Yet the response from those who had long guarded the flow of information was not panic, nor was it open destruction. The old methods of censorship had evolved. The Church and other authorities understood that controlling the fire of knowledge required a gentler hand. Instead of burning books or imprisoning authors, they guided forgetting. Certain ideas were allowed to spread, while others were quietly omitted, lost in the flood of paper. Encyclopedias became both a tool of enlightenment and of selective memory. Editors chose which discoveries to highlight and which historical periods to summarize in ways that omitted inconvenient truths. Entire chapters of forgotten knowledge could vanish simply by never being included, and the public would never know they had been excluded. Printing presses exposed some truths, but also provided cover for control. Newspapers reported current events, yet rarely touched the roots of history that might challenge long-held authority. The age of exposure was a paradox. Light was given, but shadows remained. The masses could read, yet they read what someone else had decided was safe to know. Meanwhile, secret archives continued to hold the most dangerous knowledge, those manuscripts that could overturn accepted narratives, those discoveries that had been preserved for centuries by monks, scholars, and shadow networks. The public believed they were witnessing a world fully revealed, but much remained carefully concealed. Even in classrooms, textbooks reflected this dual strategy. Students were taught scientific principles and history, yet often the deeper connections, the controversial discoveries, and the suppressed inventions were omitted. Knowledge was spreading, yet curated. Newspapers and encyclopedias became both windows and mirrors. The reader glimpsed reality, yet only the parts deemed acceptable. History was no longer written in silence, but it was edited through omission, and yet the exposure could not be fully stopped. Ideas that could not be censored outright found ways to survive. Scientists published observations in coded language or in obscure journals. Philosophers embedded radical thoughts in fiction or poetry. Artists painted truths into allegory, architecture encoded mathematics, and music carried ratios and proportions that echoed the lessons of centuries-old secret schools. The age of exposure was not a revolution of knowledge, but a controlled widening of its access. It balanced revelation with restraint. It was a subtle negotiation between curiosity and authority, showing that light could be shared, yet never entirely free. Those who paid attention learned to read between the lines, to notice what was absent as much as what was present, and to question why some truths were loudly celebrated while others were quietly forgotten. In this way, the age of exposure became a test of discernment, teaching not only what to know, but also how to know who had decided what could be seen. By the 20th century, the word Illuminati had transformed. Once whispered in the margins of manuscripts, it had become a fixture of rumour, a figure of suspicion, and eventually a subject of ridicule. Novels, films, and comics painted the Illuminati as shadowy conspirators controlling the world from behind closed doors. Their origins twisted into caricature. This modern echo, while amusing to some, serves a purpose deeper than entertainment. Ridicule is the newest lock on the oldest door. The very idea that a group might quietly preserve knowledge and influence thought is rendered absurd, and in doing so, dismissed from serious consideration. The legends of Freemasons, Rosicrucians, secret societies, and shadow networks are folded into jokes, memes, and dramatic plots. The historical reality of scholars ferrying light across centuries, of monks and scientists protecting dangerous ideas, is replaced by fiction. Yet the pattern remains. When something is made too strange or too ridiculous to believe, curiosity dies before it has a chance to spark. The public laughs, and the flame of inquiry, which once travelled carefully through letters, lodges, and hidden archives, is locked behind skepticism and dismissal. History itself becomes a theatre again, only now the actors are imagination and satire rather than inquisitors and judges. The archives remain sealed, the double ledgers hidden, and the lessons encoded in cathedrals and manuscripts are ignored because the audience cannot take them seriously. Popular culture turns the names into symbols of paranoia and control, but it also ensures that the true story is buried in plain sight. The caricature does more than entertain. It protects the vaults, the ledgers, the flame. It ensures that the casual observer believes the door is imaginary and does not even attempt to open it. Scholars who once moved quietly among churches, lodges, and universities become, in the popular mind, figures of fantasy. Their sacrifices, their careful maintenance of knowledge, their delicate balance of secrecy and light are forgotten. The modern echo is a form of selective forgetting, as subtle as any inquisition. It shifts attention from real patterns of preservation and control to imagined conspiracies safe for public consumption. And yet, for those willing to look, the traces remain. Cathedrals encode geometry, archives hold contradictions, letters whisper questions, and lodges contain symbols of centuries-old knowledge. The laughter does not erase them. It only hides them from those who are content with surface stories. In the 21st century, the Illuminati is no longer just a network or a rumour. It is a lens through which society filters the impossible idea that knowledge and power have long travelled together, quietly, invisibly, shaping the world without spectacle. Ridicule becomes a wall stronger than steel because it convinces everyone that the door never existed, while the light continues to burn on the other side, patiently waiting for someone who dares to look beyond the joke. And so, the oldest patterns endure, masked in myth, preserved in laughter, as the modern echo resonates across centuries, reminding us that truth does not always seek applause. We return to the vault, deeper than any library, beneath stone corridors that have felt no sunlight for centuries. The air is cool and still, the silence absolute. Here, the second lamp burns, a light not intended for spectacle or praise, but for those who dare to seek. It is human and imperfect, yet it illuminates more than the eye can see. Every manuscript, every chart, every diagram is positioned carefully, not for convenience, but to challenge the mind. The vault does not answer questions, it asks them. Each shelf, each carefully stored codex, each hidden compartment holds a fragment of knowledge, a piece of a puzzle that cannot be completed by a single generation. It is a deliberate invitation. The church, the scholars, the secret societies who preserved this light understood that illumination must be earned. It cannot be handed to the unprepared. The vault waits patiently for those who are willing to look beyond the surface, who understand that what is withheld is as important as what is displayed. Outside the walls, the world continues in patterns shaped by centuries of control, censorship, and guidance. History is written, taught, and repeated in forms that comfort and entertain, yet the second lamp remains untouched, burning quietly beneath the weight of tradition. Its glow does not reach the streets, the schools, or the newsprints. It is reserved for thought, observation, and courage. To follow this light requires patience. It requires questions that may never be fully answered, and curiosity that cannot be easily satisfied. The lamp itself does not judge. It does not approve or condemn. It simply exists, a constant reminder that knowledge, once kindled, cannot be extinguished, even if it is hidden. The second lamp teaches through absence as much as through illumination. The missing pages, the unread texts, the contradictions carefully preserved, all of it forms a map for those attentive enough to notice. Every hidden detail is a guide, a lesson in discernment, a call to explore. Some have glimpsed it, briefly, in letters, in symbols carved into stone, in instruments that measure the sky and the stars. They carry the light forward in silence, in secret, ensuring that the flame survives for the next generation of seekers. The story does not resolve neatly, nor does it promise easy answers. That is the point. Knowledge is not a treasure to be claimed, but a journey to be undertaken. The second lamp remains out of reach, because only the effort to approach it matters. The invitation is simple and persistent. Follow the light, even when it is kept just out of sight. Question, observe, decode, and carry forward what you discover. For the world is always ready to forget, to distract, to mislead. The lamp asks only that you notice, that you care, that you persist. And so we leave the vault, the corridor of manuscripts stretching into shadow, the air still thick with possibilities. The second lamp continues to burn, patient, unassuming, and eternal, waiting for the one who will not merely see, but truly understand that the pursuit of light is never complete, and the act of seeking is its own illumination.